going to introduce today's moderator. Stephen Cruz is the Deputy Digital Director and a spokesperson for the LIBRE initiative. That's the largest national conservative Hispanic outreach group in the country. He works on projects for them to engage the Hispanic community, to advance economic freedom and prosperity. He started with them in June 2012, and he helped manage the grassroots operations across the country. He currently also serves on a leadership position on the board for Vanguard PAC, which is a conservative millennial group, which seeks to utilize young people's conservative values, providing market-based solutions, and being politically active in that realm. He's also on the board of the FIU Alumni Association's DC chapter. Stephen is a graduate of FIU with a degree in international relations. He's also an active member of Beta Theta Pi fraternity and serves as the recruitment advisor to the George Washington University chapter and a fundraising ambassador for the National Foundation for that organization. Beyond all of that, he has published opinion editorials for outlets such as Forbes, The Daily Caller, EliteDaily.com, where he's a regular contributor, as well as Spanish language outlets like El Nuevo Herald and La Opinion. And in addition to all of that, Stephen is one of my very good friends and even served as a groomsman in my bridal party. So I'm super excited to have him here.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your lunch hour to be here. And as Eric mentioned, there's refreshments in the back, so feel free at any point to just get up and grab them. I won't be offended. I'm going to get from behind the lectern in a second, but I wanted to show you a video to kind of introduce you to what the LIBRE Initiative is and what we do before I really dive into the topic of how government regulations are harming competition and innovation. At any point, if I say something that you agree with, or even better, if I say something you disagree with, stop me right there and let's get into a conversation. This is a Tuesday Times Roundtable. So although we're not around a table, I really want this to be as interactive and as fun for you as possible. And I promise I won't talk the entire, 45 minutes.
My name is Daniel Garza, and my American experience started off here. I grew up picking crops with my family. My parents were immigrants from Mexico with nothing but a 4th grade education. We were so poor. My siblings and I would often miss school to work in the fields. Our home was the size of a tool shed. We had no running water, and what we would do is warm buckets of water on the stove so that when my parents returned from work in the fields, they would bathe with small cups. My father never took welfare because he didn't want to depend on anyone or lose his dignity. He is a proud and noble man.
You can make it with just 3 things. It's God, good credit, and freedom, liberty to work. And that's what the United States is.
I didn't know it at the time, but my father began saving money and buying and selling small properties. He bought a motel with the profit he made. My family and I spent long hours fixing up that motel while still working the fields. My father continued to buy and sell property, and one day he and my mother retired with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives.
If I don't come to the United States, I don't think I have the life that we got right now. Living so good,
My parents' American dream had become a reality. My family and I have succeeded by following the path to freedom. But that path is on the verge of vanishing. What we're starting to see here in America now is a growth in the size and the scope of government that is now starting to look like the governments that we left behind. I'm just torn apart when I see folks who are caught in this dependency that government offers. And not only that, they've condemned their children to a life of mediocrity and subsistence. That this is not the American dream. This is an American nightmare. The LIBRE Initiative is reaching the Hispanic community before they are lost forever. We know advancing economic freedom is the best way to improve human well-being, especially those at the bottom. And that's our message to the world. You know, one day I was speaking before a group of 150 evangelical Hispanic ministers in South Texas, and a man stood up. He had tears in his eyes and said, you know, I've never heard these things before. Why has nobody told us? Most Hispanics have never even heard about economic freedom, but they know it. Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, Hispanics leave countries that have been ruined by tyranny to come to America, the land of the free. They don't just believe in the cause, they've lived it. It is a privilege to live in the United States because this is a nation where you dictate your destiny. No other nation has fulfilled more dreams and more aspirations than this country. And to have been born here, I'm just grateful to God for that.
Learn how you can get involved at joinlibre.org.
All right, so that really is what I do, and Daniel Garza is my boss, and there's a really topical line in that video. America has become the country that has fulfilled more dreams and more aspirations than any in the past, and that has a lot to do not only with the hardworking spirit of our people, but with the environment that allows you to put forth the full exercise of your talents, the free market that lets you say, if I have a good idea, and I can work hard, and I can do this better than somebody else, I'm going to prosper. So for the past 150 years, we've seen this burgeoning revolution of what America is, and it has come because of those principles and those policies that our government has for the longest time been propelling. However, we find ourselves now in a situation where that's no longer the case. He talked about the path to prosperity being eroded. And that's really what this talk is about. It's about how regulation is stifling innovation, it's destroying competition, and it's really putting a damper on each and every single person's ability to prosper and to be successful, because no longer can it be said that you have a good idea and you're going to go out there and you're going to find the resources and the help needed to make that idea a reality, and that because your good idea and your hard work are coming together, you're going to be successful. Did you guys get a chance to read the New York Times article, The Evolution of Trust? That's okay. I actually didn't read it until this weekend either. I was planning on coming in here and ad-libbing it, but then I figured that I should probably be a little prepared. But I want to ask you a couple simple questions before we get started with the discussion. Have any of you ever heard of Uber or Airbnb, Lyft, Zipcar? Yeah, raise your hands if you had. I actually took an Uber to FIU this morning because they're brand new in Miami and they've had a lot of issues getting here. So I figured that I needed to help the company a little bit. And it was much cheaper than a cab and so much more comfortable. This Mercedes picked me up instead of this like nasty yellow taxi cab. So if you haven't taken one, I recommend it. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, or Zipcar. Oh, you know what? This one. Have you guys heard of Sabra? Anybody like hummus here? So this is a perfect example there. Yeah. Sabra is a subsidiary of PepsiCo. Pepsi is a huge international company. Earlier this year, Sabra petitioned to the Federal Drug Administration to make the definition of hummus only that which Sabra sells. So anything, if that happens, anything that's labeled hummus would come out of the Sabra plants. So all of a sudden, if you're making something at home, you can call it this chickpea paste, but you can't call it hummus. Like, does anybody think that that's something that's acceptable or that should be condoned by the government of the United States? I didn't think so, because the same way that you're looking at a restriction in your ability to call hummus hummus and what's in a name, it is what it is. You see taxi lobbies here in Miami or in the state of Virginia, which have been the two biggest topics, stopping Uber from getting into those markets, from revolutionizing the way that we transport, that we move people and assets across one city, because they don't want the competition. They don't want you to pay slightly more for a service that you prefer because it's more comfortable, because it's more in tune with your needs, and because it's delivering value to you. And that's what it's all about in a market economy, value creation.
Yeah, so I guess in reference to the way this is mentioned in the article, David Brooks claims that Airbnb and Uber seem inclined to compromise and play nice. Uber is like sort of new to Miami because it's sort of illegal in Miami. And Uber and Lyft, I don't know if anyone has heard of this, are like actively involved in messing with each other as companies, particularly Uber, like sending fake drivers to like Lyft calls and stuff. This has been in the news, and like the reason why it's illegal in certain cities is because there are taxi drivers who are currently operating within a framework that's existed for a long time that protects like their ability to make a living as a full-time taxi driver. And so Lyft and Uber show up, and often in like while flouting the sort of government regulations that are there to protect the taxi drivers. What do you make of that? That seems like David Brooks is straight up being inaccurate, and there are consequences for taxi drivers when Uber shows up.
Well,
what would you say to those people who have paid a bunch of money for a medallion from the city about their livelihood? Like, just like, screw you, join Lyft?
so the city imposing regulations in order for you to get a medallion, for you to be able to drive, that's the first issue. The very nature of capitalism tells us that if you can deliver a product better, then you can do it.
I'm worried about, like, the actual taxi drivers in Miami now. Like, what is your answer to them? Like, we shouldn't have ever had this medallion system, and thus you are still screwed now? Like, what?
To the taxi drivers themselves, my answer would be that they need to renegotiate the regulations that they're living under. Uber and Lyft aren't coming in here and asking not to be a completely unregulated economy. They also have to abide by certain rules.
Like, Uber showed up with like their like alternate system. Like, they tried to operate in Miami while it was still illegal.
But why is it illegal in Miami? Do you have a question?
To protect the taxi drivers. That's why.
But why is government inclined to protect the taxi driver vis-a-vis another company that's also doing the same type of work? Like, then we're picking winners and losers, and that is not the role of government. The role of government is to facilitate an exchange of commerce.
No, just wanted to add. I think that the question is not if, because you mentioned that Uber and Lyft, maybe they weren't playing on the right side because they were doing some things that weren't right. The question is not if those services are good or bad. If those are good services, they are not going to prosper here. The question is, why can't we have options? You know, why does the government decide that we cannot have options? I know that there are rules for taxi drivers, of course, and that's fine, and they are under the law, and that's great. And many people would still prefer to take a taxi instead of an Uber because they feel more comfortable with that. But I think that the question is, like, why does the government is the one deciding if I can have an option whenever I want to transport in the city, besides me deciding if this service is better than this one?
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. People maybe should have options, but it's just disingenuous to say that they're, playing nice when actually they're actively trying to disrupt these economies and show up, whether or not it's legal, to get people to like this system that's.
Well, so you hit on it. They do come into a local economy and disrupt it. That's the nature of their game. That is the nature of a technology startup. They come in and they find a market that's on tap and that's ripe for competition. And so we have to get into a conversation of, is competition good or bad? You have a
the economy. You can't monopolize it. You have to, there has to be rules for the game. You can't just let one company rule everything.
Well, one taxi company rules everything.
Well,
We have a question here.
Like the cell phone company. I mean, at the beginning started with AT&T, right? And now you have Metro, T-Mobile, all these different companies. They offer different plans. You choose whatever works better for you. You don't have to go with taxi.
No, absolutely. And to talk about monopolies, there's also, anybody ever have a problem with Comcast? I completely understand you.
I was going to say, I wouldn't know what Uber was if I didn't happen to spend a few days in New York a few months ago. So just in case, can we get a brief overview of exactly how those companies operate?
Sure. So companies like Uber, Lyft, Zipcar, they're what are called peer-to-peer economies. So it's a shared service where participant A delivers a service to participant B, and it's based on this new trust calculus, where now all of a sudden we don't need a huge AT&T company to stand behind a brand, and I'm going to trust AT&T because they're huge and everybody uses them. I'm going to trust Uber or Airbnb because my peers are using it, because there's this review system, because I can see through their social capital what it is that they're doing. So that's the basis of these companies, and what they do is that they give you the service that you're looking for at a premium price, because they kind of add in the things that they like. Uber in particular is a transportation service. So you have an app on your phone, you call a car, that car shows up, and you can track where it's going, you get in it, and then a cashless transaction takes you where you want to go. Is that a fair overview of what it is? Anybody want to talk about peer-to-peer economies and how actually the rise of companies like Uber has a lot more to do with the government that Uber itself would like to agree with, because of the stagnation of the middle class, because of the big government policies that are destroying people's ability to make a living? We have to get competitive. We have to get creative. We have to innovate. And so all of a sudden, all these different ways for people to make money are popping up. And Uber's now a $1 billion enterprise that's transforming the way we move people and goods and services across the world. Anybody have any comments on that?
What do you mean that the government is crushing people's ability to make a living?
Well, so we can talk about very actual numbers. We can talk about the fact that the unemployment rate in this country is 6.2%. Topical to FIU and to a university, Hispanic unemployment is 8.2%. Hispanic millennial unemployment is 9.3%. Overall millennial unemployment is 14%. That means we're losing money because we're losing jobs. Companies like, I'm getting to it. Companies, small businesses in particular, account for 26 million jobs across the country. Every time new regulations come out, and topical and in the news, anybody heard of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare? I figured that's all we've been talking about for the past 2 years. The Affordable Care Act imposes a series of regulations, particularly on small businesses. Anybody that hires more than 50 employees needs to all of a sudden comply with all of these things. That costs you an additional amount of money. That costs you extra time. That big companies can put up with because they can hire Accenture or Deloitte to do their books and to deal with all that stuff. But your mom and pop store, your small business down in 8th Street that's been there for the past 50 years can no longer subsidize that. And so you either have a conversation about, well, let me cut hours, which is what we've seen a lot. Let me cut employees, which is what we've seen a lot. Or let me figure out a way to cheat the system. So instead of offering people the opportunity to really play into healthcare, which is a completely separate conversation and one that, yes, needs to be reformed, you all of a sudden are enabling people to go out of their way, to play outside of the lines, and to find a way to cheat the system. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about the government causing a stagnation of the middle class. You're all of a sudden seeing an erosion of this working class.
But then anyone who actually is full-time employed has health insurance, and then catastrophic illness can't just destroy their life. Isn't that protecting the middle class?
But so you get into the argument of you're picking winners and losers, which is not the role of the government, because all of a sudden
must be insured. That's not picking winners and losers.
But then what happens when the jobs aren't there anymore? So you don't have a job, so you're not getting insurance. So you have this catch-22.
Yes, but that's always been true. You don't have a job, you don't have insurance.
But there's less available jobs because of the regulations that are coming through for insurance.
The unemployment at 6% is down relative to when the Affordable Care Act was instituted.
It's down from
Relative to when, right? 6.2% is down from the 8 or 10 it was a couple years ago.
And so we find that this new normal is still acceptable because, in my opinion, we went from a 3% unemployment rate across the country to a 12%, and now we're slowly climbing our way back. And regulations such as the Affordable Care Act, not the only one, the Environmental Protection Agency also puts out a bevy of regulations every other day that stop businesses from really engaging in the full development of their product lines. So you have issues with regulations stopping people from being entrepreneurial. And that's a great line of thought. I really think that there's a conversation about overregulation, which really gets at the heart of this, because you have to strike a balance between the protection of the citizenry as a whole and enabling people to be self-determinant and to really engage in hard work and use that as a way to prosper. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments?
I think saying that you have to draw the line is a really important point because it's really an arbitrary line. But it's true. I mean, you can't just argue that all regulations are bad or that all regulations are good. I like knowing that as a general rule that I can buy a product or buy food from somewhere and I won't die because regulations make sure that there's consumer safety and there's food safety. And so, I mean, there's definitely conversations to be had about what is overregulation. It's definitely frustrating to see something so innovative like a service where you can pick up people in your car in your spare time and you make money and they get a good service being stifled by regulation and those things will be hammered out. But the general rule, living somewhere where most of the time I don't die from engaging in commerce is a nice feeling. So the general premise of regulations existing.
Well, so let me give you two examples. Anybody heard about this crazy disease going on around the world called Ebola? Yeah, it's been in the news again. The only thing we've been talking about. Anybody heard about this one guy that was miraculously cured from Ebola due to a vaccine that the CDC had developed but had been unable to test because the FDA prohibits, and rightfully so in most cases, live testing and the testing on human trial cases for a variety of reasons. There's this movement called Right to Try, which big government regulations are stopping. However, had this case not been as high profile as it was, we wouldn't have a working cure for Ebola. That's one example. And then another example is now there's regulations to, let me ask you this question. What is the one thing that you would be surprised if you heard that it was being regulated nowadays by the government? Water. Okay, well, water is actually regulated for, a good reason, water treatment and things like that. But thanks for participating. Anybody else?
Migrant farm worker wages. I would be shocked if the government was regulating that.
Illegal immigration. Not even going to touch that one.
No, the wages of farm workers who have to, pick produce. They are not paid minimum wage by the hour.
Well, and so that's interesting because we talk about systems like E-Verify, which would lead to you knowing who is in the workforce, and therefore you can add reasonable controls into, okay, the standard of living is this, and you need to pay people the minimum wage of the United States.
That would be a great regulation.
But why would you be shocked if you heard it's not being regulated? Or, I'm sorry, why would you be shocked to hear it's being now regulated?
Because the American public doesn't care.
That's also being regulated nowadays by the EPA, pollution standards, CO2 emissions, your carbon footprint. Oh, well, yeah, that would be a little ridiculous. Anybody else? I'll tell you what shocked me recently. Medication?
You could they won't regulate you to anything. You could also have some
Sure. Those are all great points. But let me tell you what's now being regulated, and I see no reason why it should be. Anybody ever participate in a bake sale, either here in GC or in your high schools and middle schools to raise money for the band trip? Regulations started first in Illinois and now are being moved on by the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. for school bake sales to be regulated. Now, the justification is food allergies, and you don't know whether something has gluten, and a student is allergic to gluten, or are they allergic to dairy, or are they allergic to peanuts, or are they allergic to this or that or the other. So you have to have a conversation, and again, Eric, you made a good point about you have to see where the line is, but what we have to have a conversation about is where does the government get the right to tell us, you can no longer sell cookies at this bake sale to pay for your kid's band trip because one student out of 100 might be allergic to gluten. Is that not incumbent upon the individual to think and to know, I am allergic to gluten, I can't have anything containing peanuts, I am lactose intolerant, therefore I can participate. I can willingly engage in giving you this dollar for you to give me this cookie. Like, that is a private partnership and a private transaction between two willing individuals. There's no need for the government to present an externality into that conversation and to regulate that market, which is a peer-to-peer economy and should therefore be unregulated.
So my question is, because I believe that, a lot of regulation does hinder entrepreneurship in the U.S., but my problem is with a lot of free market policies is that how do we account for externalities without the government? And that's my biggest problem is that we have a lot of environmental issues and other things that go on that entrepreneurs and sometimes businesses do without taking into account the social damages that are presented. So aside from that, of course, there's plenty of other examples we won't just talk about in practice and everything, in which we're being hindered in bigger industries and we're losing out to competition internationally. But how do we account for these other externalities that you mentioned?
Well, and so I won't tell you that I have all the answers. I guess that's the first and foremost. If I did, I'd be working, for the Department of Education or the EPA or one of these big regulation enforcing agencies. But from where I'm standing and from what I see, it all starts with first determining what is the appropriate role of government in the lives of people. Is it to regulate the overall functioning of the system? I can believe that. I can believe that we have a societal responsibility to make sure that we don't completely ruin the environment. And I can believe that we have a societal responsibility to make sure that basic human rights are met and not transgressed again. What I can't believe is that from that 30,000-foot view, the government is going to get into regulation of small businesses and bake sales. That the government is going to tell you, you, sir, can only expel this much carbon dioxide. You, sir, and your company can only pollute this much. You can borrow your neighbor's pollution credits. So we do that at a macro level. But the government is now trying to do that at a micro level. They're trying to bring in some of these international concepts into small economies like the intra-economy of the United States, and all of a sudden we're stopping people from actually engaging in commerce.
I have a question. Who monitors these regulations that get so low as the peer? Lyft is big, it's a bigger company and it's growing, but were they monitoring that when they were just starting out, or is it now becoming a problem because you're actually getting bigger? You know what I mean?
Well, and so that's a very good point that you make, because 6 months ago or a year ago, Lyft and Uber particularly Uber, weren't companies that were grossing over $1 million in profit. So the government didn't have any interest in getting a piece of that pie. But now we have this unregulated market that's generating profit at an unprecedented amount. We find ourselves in a huge financial default, and so the government's trying to make money where it can. It makes it out of each and every single person's individual's taxes that they take out when you're paying for unfunded liabilities like Social Security, which we will never see unless it's reformed, but we still get it taken out of our paycheck. That's the same concept that you can apply to why they're all of a sudden regulating companies like Uber and Lyft at the level that they're regulating it. You can also say that they're doing it at the behest of crony groups like taxi lobbies, whether it's one company or an alliance of 15 that they would rather compete with one another because they offer the same service that they've been offering for the past 50 years instead of compete with the young up-and-coming guy that just got in the ring and it's kicking butt and taking names. So I think that's a huge piece of the pie that they're not getting and that they want. So it ultimately comes down to cash, in my opinion.
Okay, so I think it's easy to be sympathetic against regulations when we keep talking about small businesses. I think of the company that provided our food today, which is a small local caterer. But what about when you scale up to, do your principles hold true even when you get up to companies like Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase with some of their things and financial regulations? And so that part A, and then with your big sale example, I completely understand why that's frustrating, but just philosophically, once you scale up to Pillsbury or something selling something in the store, is it still the consumer's responsibility because they're willingly engaging in purchasing it to call and ask us to have or putting things in the regulated and labeled. And so scaling up is when you're with the big companies.
I believe the concept holds true, and I'll address both examples, and I'll give you an extra one. Let's start with the Pillsbury because, it's lunchtime and I'm kind of hungry, so we can go there. Pillsbury and companies of the sort, Nestle, Hershey, they will all label their products as contains gluten, contains nut oils or peanuts. It's incumbent upon you as the individual to look at what you're buying and decide, this is going to kill me, therefore I will not pay for it, and I will not get it.
Are heavily regulated by the federal government.
But there we talk about reasonable regulations on the market. What this article and what this talk is discussing is over-regulation. There is a normative contract that exists between people, society, and that is what empowers the government to act. It's when you go above and beyond that contract that we get into conversations about why you are trying as an entity to determine the interactions between two people. We talk about Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase. Anybody familiar with this newly formed government agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is formed by an act of Congress in 2009 as a way to protect individuals from bad banking and lending practices, which are the things that we see led to the economic fallout and the recession in 2007, 2008, depending on who you're asking. So in essence, coming out of a recession, you think this is a great agency, we really need to be protected from these big conglomerate banks that are running the world. Then in practice, you come to 2012 and you see, in 2014 now, but the scandal really broke in 2012, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has the most consumer data out of any other agency, including the NSA, some critics will tell you. And if you've heard about the NSA, you know that they even know when you go to the bathroom. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau knows what you buy, when you buy it, why you buy it, and how you buy it. And they do that under the guise of trying to protect you from bad lending practices. I don't see how the CFPB, knowing that every Tuesday I go to Starbucks for my, pumpkin spice latte fix, is protecting me from anything. Well, what they're doing is they're accumulating a body of research on individuals that then they can use to track your spending patterns, to advertise to you. It can be very innocent things. I'm not telling you that there's this big conspiracy for the government to know what you're doing, but the fact of it is that they know what you're doing. And the conversation here is, why do they have that information and what it is that they plan to do with it?
I mean, personally, information is power, any way you look at it, and that information can only be used to help some individual or a group of individuals in order to market better to the public and see. I mean, you can calculate just by the NSA knowing, for example, what people are doing and where they're planning on traveling to do. They can see if it's worth investing in oil just because it was more flights are going to be taken or more cars are going to be used. And you can calculate all that. I mean, they have research coming all over the place, and they do sell that information because Facebook sells it to the government already, to the NSA. They have contracts with Facebook that actually can, I don't know if anyone's ever read the agreements of it, but if you read it, you'll see verbatim, they can turn on your phone at any given time, record your conversations, take your pictures, anything they want to do, and they give that off to the government. So that information is used at some point to help some sort of situation. And again, the Starbucks thing, you don't particularly need to know that I buy a coffee, but if you know that I buy from Starbucks more than Bustelo, someone can know that I be smart to invest in Starbucks stocks instead of Bustelo stocks.
And so, what do you think about that? Because for the example of Facebook, so one time I heard this joke about nobody ever reading the terms and conditions and the cure of cancer being in the terms and condition agreements of everything, and nobody's ever going to find them. So I took the time to go read the Facebook terms and conditions, because a lot of the work that I do is with Facebook. They can do just about anything that they want with the data that you willingly surrender to them. The difference here is Facebook is a private entity, you're a private entity, and you're giving over that data to them. The CFPB is using congressional mandates to appropriate data that's based on your transactions. Tell me then, why should the government know that it's good to market to you Starbucks over Bustelo? Like, what purpose does that serve? to your head, and then I'll go to you.
Okay, it's completely speculative that that is what the government is doing with your data. Right now, there's no reason to think the federal government is playing favorites between Starbucks and Mustello with your Facebook data.
I hope not.
Right. So basically, I think what we need to remember, the place that the government derives this right to do all of those things is us. Like, we are the government. U.S. citizens are the people like looking at the computers that may or may not have data that may or may not be abused by the government or whatever.
Doesn't the government actually express powers in the Constitution?
Yeah, where do you think they got those? Us. Like, it's not, the government is not a thing.
Well, so let me hit on what you just said. It is individuals who are behind the computers at the NSA, and this conversation went way left, but that are behind the computers at the NSA looking at the data that you have. Earlier this year, there were reports of people the employees of the NSA passing around individuals' nude photos that they had sent to one another, again, in private communications and private contracts. What good does it serve the government to know what you send your girlfriend, boyfriend, or your random friend on Snapchat?
So I'm not gonna like try to defend the government for sure. It's pretty messed up, you know. But and all the data they collect is pretty crazy. But I would have to agree with them. It's like we don't have any evidence that the government's using this data to try and push one company over the other. And I would say that the reason why you want to collect some of this consumer data is that it's incomplete, right? For like creating economic policies, you want to figure out how consumers across the nation might be spending money. Yes, I agree that they don't need such detail, but when creating for certain investments and creating for interest rates and developing certain policies, it could be useful. Like I said, they don't need such detail. I agree with you on that point, but to some degree, it's useful to have that data because to understand how they're spending money on construction versus people buying sandwiches, that can be useful.
But so you talk about, to a certain extent, they need the data. The same way that to a certain, well, yeah, to create government policies that actually serve the people, to a certain extent, you need evidence in order to make data-driven decisions. Same way that to a certain extent, in order to protect people's well-being, you need regulations that preclude harm from coming to people. The problem comes in when we're talking about over-regulation, when we're talking about overly mining for information. So it's not black or white, it's a matter of degrees here.
So, roughly you're saying that there is no evidence that the government is picking one corporation, Starbucks or Mustello or the other. Is there evidence that the government is using all this data to implement like proper policy or implement like proper any type of?
What does the government ever implement proper?
And that's an entire different Seize the Time roundtable.
This is just sort of something I thought about 3 months ago. I read an article about, I think it was over 15 different laws that the NSA has broken that should have been our Constitution, right? And they're not being tried. But I started thinking about it. I said, well, if the NSA, for example, when Obama got voted in, someone tweeted, oh, Obama better be careful, he might get shot. The FBI was at that guy's house for half an hour, arrested him, and took him in under, terrorists or whatever.
Sure.
So if the NSA can do that in half an hour, my question isn't just structurally arguing it. They know all the drug dealing that's going on in the world because everyone tags, whatever, all the trafficking of weapons, everything is done with cell phone. You might be able to buy a portable phone that's not tracked, a remote phone, but if you know where that number was bought, you can also check any AT&T store or any store in the world has cameras. So you can check the time that was purchased and you can have pictures of who are buying these phones. So technically, in some way, shape, or form, if they can find someone in half an hour after they tweet something, why couldn't they find all the drug dealers, all the weapons traffickers, and everything? And my question is, where is this war on drugs, war on terrorism, war on weapons going? I mean, they should have all that information because they have everything else about us. So, my question is, if it's true, we have no proof that they are helping us, we have no proof that they aren't helping us. But we do have proof that they have proof, because they do have it, and they publicly admit it. So, what is, if they're not helping us with the economic side of the economy, where are our rights being defended?
In what sense does the Affordable Care Act not constitute help? Like, you are able to stay on your parents' insurance if they have insurance until you're 26. That is helpful to people ages like 18 to 26.
Yeah, but
that is an economic help.
To join, it's a tax as well. When I read it, and I was all for it at first, but when I read it, and I was working for a startup that, because of the Affordable Health Care Act, right, they were able to have a whole innovation of their own idea. So it did spur some kind of entrepreneurship to some degree. But at the same time, at our age, less than 26 or something, when I look through the terms and conditions, really it's the health insurance companies that are screwing us up anyway. It's actually cheaper for us not to have the health insurance. So it's more of a tax for the government to be implemented.
Yes,
the whole idea, after reading it, I realized that actually it just actually helps the insurance companies rather than regulate them as we all thought it was.
No,
And so that is the actual problem with the Affordable Care Act, if I may. The issue here is that it relies on us in this room, the under 26, young, relatively healthy,
which just makes sense,
to subsidize older and sicker Americans. It doesn't do it in a way where you're willingly entering into the system. It imposes upon you a penalty, whereas if you don't join it, you have to pay a tax, which in most cases, that penalty results in being much cheaper than the monthly premium that you have to pay. People in Florida have seen 57% of an increase. In New Mexico, young men 127 years old, 170% of an increase on their premiums. So you have to have a conversation, again, about why is the government able to impose this tax upon you?
Because they allowed it by voting for people who did it.
And so that's why we're talking about overregulation and the issues that brings, because then, November 4th, 63 days from now, there is an election. In 2016, there is another election, and you have the opportunity as a democratic country to affect the transitions of government and therefore the laws. So that's why we're talking about this.
So bringing this back to Uber and Lyft and peer-to-peer, the entrepreneurship and creativity of companies is clearly an example of that conservative organizations like yours uphold and advocate for. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask for your opinion on the political dynamics behind Uber hiring Obama's former campaign manager to be on their side.
It's interesting because I read a Wall Street Journal article 2 weeks ago that called something which at first made me chuckle, the Obama economy. There is this cash crop that has risen around the administration's senior officials being able to leave after they have dutifully served their time and go into these huge private sector companies to lend their, strategic advice. It has always been done, but that government industrial complex that we have seen surge over the past 6 years is much more evident now than it was 10 years ago, or that it was in the Clinton years, or that it was in the Bush senior years, so that it was in any year prior. So that's what they're talking about, that Obama economy. That person that they hired to be one of the executives at Uber, eminently qualified to lead and be at the helm of this company. And they are, because they bring insight into government, because they are preeminent leaders in their field. However, you can't discount the fact that they now have access and influence to the top echelons of power in Washington, and that is also valuable to companies. Any final thoughts that you guys might have? I hope you found this useful to some degree, that the conversation was stimulating. I certainly enjoyed being here, and I'm going to ask Eric to let me come again sometime. So hopefully we can get to see each other one more time. If you don't have anything else to add, I think that this is pretty much it and wraps it up. Nobody? Well, thank you so much for coming.